Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome to Tech Tested. Valheim is a popular new title that is taking the gaming scene by storm, but when it comes to system specs, how low can you go? If you clicked on this video, you probably already know what Valheim is, but in case you don't, it's an open-world survival game based on a medieval fantasy setting. And while the graphics are pretty, they're quite reminiscent of the Nintendo 64 polygon era, which would make you think this thing might be able to run on a potato. A quick glance at the internet might reinforce that theory, since the listed minimum system requirements are a rather vague 2.4 GHz dual core, 4 GB of RAM, and a 500 series NVIDIA card, which could wildly vary based on the graphics card in that series. So I pulled together some computer parts that would be pretty representative of the minimum system requirements. I got a dual-core AMD Athlon 2X2 215, which, while clocked at 2.7 GHz, doesn't really make a difference, as you will see in a little bit. Using the stock cooler, I slapped it into a rather cheap AM3 Plus motherboard, seeing as how if you're going for minimum system specs, I'm guessing you also don't have a ton of money to throw at a motherboard. We also ran with 4 GB of DDR3 1333 MHz, and to round it off, we used a GTX 460. Now you may be saying to yourself, the 460, that's not a 500 series card, that doesn't count. I understand what you're saying. However, the 400 and 500 series NVIDIA cards are based on a similar architecture, the Fermi architecture, and so I figured this would at least be representative of the very low-end 500 series cards that they don't seem to exclude from their recommendations. Rounding it out, since the game only takes up 1 GB, we were able to use a simple 120 gig SSD, and we're using an OEM Dell power supply, which will supply ample power for our system, although we will have to use a dongle to get the full power for our graphics card. However, the TDP of this system falls well within the 550 watts of this power supply. Getting into the game, we cranked all of our settings all the way down, and we set the resolution to 720p because, gosh dang it, it's 2021, and if we can't play at 720p, what are we even here for? With that said, we got an average frame rate of 15.9 FPS with the stock settings on our low-end hardware. Hardly something I would call playable, especially considering how stuttery it was even at such a low frame rate. So already we're off to a bad start. The minimum system requirements don't seem to be holding up quite so well. So what we did was we decided to upgrade the processor to a Phenom 2X4, a quad-core processor, which gives us not only 4 cores instead of 2, but it also gives us a higher clock speed of 3.2 GHz, and it also gives us L3 cache, which the Athlon was lacking and games utilize quite a bit. Upgrading to the quad core improved things dramatically, seeing an average frame rate of 27.5 frames per second. However, there was still quite a bit of stuttering, so we had to keep upgrading our hardware. Next, we upgraded our RAM from 4 GB to 6 GB. This did not give us a tangible improvement in performance. However, you can see in the overlay that when we upgraded our RAM to 6 GB, our utilization went up above 4 GB, which indicates that we do benefit somehow from more RAM. Just keep in mind, I didn't see any perceivable improvements, but either way, it's kind of hard to get your hand on less than 8 GB of RAM these days, so you're probably better off just getting 8 GB as it is. So what's holding us back now? It's our graphics card. And while I didn't have a 500 series card to test with, I thought the best way to get there was to overclock our GTX 460. And I went from 720 MHz on the core to 840 MHz on the core, and I also bumped the memory frequency up 100 MHz. And that saw a tangible improvement. We finally got a playable frame rate of 34.4 frames per second. Now, you did see occasional stuttering, but things smoothed out quite a bit at 720p. So we got playable frame rates at 720p, yes! But what if we crank it up to 1080p, where most people are actually playing? So I did that, and we saw our performance drop back down to 24.6 frames per second, something below what I would call playable. Seeing as how there was no more overclocking headroom on our graphics card, and that at this point was clearly our bottleneck, I decided to upgrade to my R9 270, which is the equivalent of an HD 7850. And there it was. At 1080p, we got an average frame rate of 37.4 frames per second, an experience which I would call definitely playable. There are some caveats I need to make. First of all, this was definitely the lowest graphics settings besides the resolution that we could possibly achieve, and we still weren't breaking into the 40 frames per second even with our most high-end hardware. Second, this was the starting area. I hadn't really gotten into this game, so the only area I knew to benchmark was the starting area. We cut down some trees, we ran through a little village, and we ran over by the ocean and through the forest, and that may not be entirely indicative of the entire gameplay experience. Again, we're looking at minimum spec hardware, so this is what you can scrape by with, but definitely not ideal for the situation. All right, what's the conclusion? While technically, yes, you can boot into the game with a dual core processor, you really need a quad core to actually be able to play the game. When it comes to RAM, yes, you can technically get by with 4 gigabytes, but I highly recommend going up to 8 because heaven forbid you have a web browser open in the background or maybe Discord so you can talk to your friends while playing. Those niceties do require RAM, and that is something you need to take into consideration when building your system. When it comes to the graphics card, yes, technically the 500 series will scrape you by at 720p, but just barely. I highly recommend going with something like an R9 270 to get you better frame rates at 720p or to get you into the 1080p where most people actually tend to game. So there you have it. The actual minimum system requirements for Valheim to be a playable experience are quad-core processor with at least 4 gigabytes of RAM, preferably 8, at least a GTX 560 for 720p gaming, or for 1080p, I recommend an R9 270 or higher. Now quick, before you go, big announcement, I do overclocking live streams on Saturdays at noon Eastern time. So if that's something you feel like you'd enjoy watching, definitely join us at twitch.tv/techtested. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Follow us on all of our social media platforms. Check out our Discord and our website so you can pick yourself up some Tech Tested merch. That was less eventful than I was hoping for at all. Flew over there.